When the government of the United States forcibly removed the Indian tribes from their ancestral lands to the territory of Oklahoma, it pledged itself to provide these people with peace and security, to guarantee their human rights, as long as the grass shall grow, as long as the rivers still flow. James Redbird was a Cherokee, a member of that civilized tribe which had created a written language, which had produced a statesman of the caliber of Sequoyah, which had borne its abuses at the hands of the white man with patience and dignity. His family had lived in eastern Oklahoma in the valley of the Arkansas ever since his grandparents had been driven here over the Trail of Tears. His heart cried out for his people, for the cruel burdens they bore. For the tuberculosis and malnutrition that ate their strength. For the liquor which wore down their dignity and moral fiber. And for the land, the grim, unyielding, stubborn land that was their legacy. For James Redbird, the sight of these things again made the road home a trail of tears, for he could sense that the shadow of an immense sorrow lay across this earth. The sight of home raised his spirits briefly, but they fell even further as the poverty made itself apparent, as he saw his younger brother and his father fighting an unending battle with the earth. His father, a good man, sentenced to a life at hard labor. Dana, his brother, doomed to follow in his father's footsteps. He cherished them, even as he pitied them, hated his home, even as he loved it. His mother, how good to see her, but she looked so tired. Every line on her face was a wound within himself. She deserved so much better than this poverty, this painful existence, this day-to-day endurance which was life without hope. And in the months that followed, James Redbird, too, entered upon that day-to-day existence, that merciless marathon to nowhere, which is the lot of a pitiful proportion of American Indians today. He, too, worked the soil, the stubborn soil designed to raise blisters and bend hoes. With this earth, it was hopeless to await a good harvest, and yet to stop working was to starve. Now that government boarding school was behind him, life at home would have been unendurable for James if it were not for a new interest he had developed in a nearby town. It was a highly personal interest, rather breathtaking, even somewhat bewildering. A human interest, you might say, in a lovely Kiowa girl named Nancy. Somehow the passing days had taken on new meaning since he met her. He suffered still from the harshness of his work, the grayness of his life, but at least there was something to soften the sorrow in him, to ease the bitterness, something, someone, Nancy to look forward to. it was because of her innate sensitivity, perhaps the heightened perception that sprang from her affection for him. But whatever it was, Nancy understood him better than he understood himself. She sensed the real potential he possessed and the despair that was destroying it. And she influenced him to visit someone whom she thought could help James Redbird. They visited a rural schoolhouse in the nearby hills, went to see a young man who taught there. He had been graduated from Bacome College for Indians, an unusual person. Nancy had met him at her church and was impressed by his character. An Indian with an excellent educational background, he had chosen this place in order to help the children of his own race. Yes, she wanted this man to know James, believing that he could help. But James was extremely sensitive and quick to resent what he considered outside interference. The teacher was struck by him, as was one of the children, a little Cherokee lad called Noah, who had something he wanted the stranger to see. A crayon drawing of his church. He was mighty proud of it. And in the Indian way, he wanted the stranger to have it as a gift. Couldn't talk him out of it either. So as not to hurt him, James accepted it, strangely moved. Nancy and Noah went off for a walk at her suggestion. She wanted the two men to be alone, wanted the teacher to have an opportunity to talk to James about Bacome. She hoped so hard that James would go to school in the fall, continue his education, have the chance to develop his capabilities. The teacher talked Bacome, but James' mind seemed somewhere else. James Redbird's dreams almost always took him somewhere else, far from the Cherokee hills to the great cities of Oklahoma, where a man might lose his identity as an Indian among the multitudes. When an opportunity arose to visit one of the big cities in the state a few weeks later, he seized on it hungrily, as though it were a signal, a go sign, to escape his environment for at least a few hours. What a bright and glittering thing was a city. How exciting to walk in the valleys of tall buildings. How hopeful to contemplate the spires. In such a place, one's spirits woke up singing, crying to become a part of this complex but promising pattern of progress. And yet, even here, he was reminded of his own inadequacy. Everything spoke of the future. But what future had James Redbird? What could he do but seek an escape, perhaps in a uniform that would make him seem identical to an army of others? Could a man ever escape his heritage? Or would it follow him wherever he went, even at the heart of the city, tracking him down like an invisible bloodhound, whining accusingly under its disguise of silence? You, James Redbird, Cherokee, you are different. Again, he discovered that it was only with Nancy that he could feel at peace. Only when adrift with her could he be glad of who he was. Nancy wanted him to continue his education, to apply for a scholarship to Bacome. And finally, he agreed for her sake. The teacher at the rural school had been surprised at James' decision, but delighted to write to Bacome in support of his application. He believed the seeds of promise in James Redbird could best be harvested through Bacome. James was granted one of the few available scholarships, and that September entered Bacome College at Muskogee, Oklahoma. It is the only college for Indians in the United States, and he knew of it by its reputation. It drew its students from the length and breadth of the land: Hopis from Arizona, Crows from Montana, Wampanoags from Massachusetts, even San Blas from Panama. And it drew its students from all denominations and all faiths. For generations, this lovely school had produced many of the leaders of the Indian population. The president made it a point to greet each incoming student, and he introduced James to his faculty advisor. This warm and friendly quality, inherent in the school and reflected by its head, quickly put James at ease. Mr. Taylor, his faculty advisor, was a quiet, kindly person who seemed genuinely glad to know him and to help him in any way he could. He pointed out the dormitory where James would live, and he left the new student with a knowledge of campus rules and regulations. Ordinarily, James would have been quick to resent rules of any kind, for as an Indian, he had grown up throttled in a web of regulations. But these had sounded reasonable, and coming from Mr. Taylor and in this lovely setting, they had even sounded pleasant. Mr. Taylor had told him something about his roommates. There was John Whirlwind, a Navajo, and a junior. And there was a senior and the president of his class, a Sioux named Howard Spotted Eagle. They treated him without ceremony, just let him know he was welcome and that they were glad to have him aboard. But the room told James a lot about them. It was a place for laughs, plenty of them, and a place for study and serious discussion, too. John, like himself, was here on a working scholarship. Didn't seem to have worn him down. And Howard, you could sense he was an outstanding fellow, interesting. And so was that photograph on his bureau. Thereafter, James Redbird was caught up in the current of campus life, and he was borne along at so brisk a pace that it seemed impossible for so much to happen in a day, for so much knowledge to be made available in each hour's classroom session. The desire to learn was so deeply rooted in this student body, so many of whom had suffered from inferior preparation on isolated and impoverished Indian reservations, that James was infected by it. There was no time to dream with so much to learn. No time to feel sorry for oneself. Even the leisure hours he could find sandwiched in between books and campus chores were overflowing with opportunities for fun and fellowship. Fun, it was the baker's dozen at Bacome. The extra dividend, unmentioned in the catalog, but permeating every facet of its life. Fellowship, it was the cornerstone of this institution, conceived and created by early missionaries who endeavored to bring the gospel to a people whose gods were now prostrate. who yearn for a new way of life, who deserve to hear the God-given message of hope. Thus, the center of life at Bacome has always been the chapel. Here services are held, scripture studied, and testimonies offered by students across the years who have found the way through Christ. Howard Spotted Eagle was one, and he spoke of it at chapel, told with deep humility of the power and the peace that had come to him, and that could come to all of his people if they but took the trail our Lord had marked. Bacome College possesses an outstanding art department, directed by one of the finest American Indian painters in the land today, and himself a Bacome graduate. The Indian's hands have traditionally been his great medium of expression. Through them have poured his beautiful arrangements of color, his lyrical sense of form, his magnificent quality of design, in every aspect of his life in the Pueblos or on the plains. And James Redbird had discovered a power in his own hands that he had been unaware of until coming to Bacome. His was a rich source of talent that only now was being tapped, and fortunately, under the guidance of a competent teacher and fine artist. And James discovered that he had something to say through those hands, for he had found his heritage. At Bacome, students were taught to honor the traditions of their people, be proud of the past, but look to the future was in essence the spirit of the college. James Redbird had become the top student in the class. Professional firms from major cities occasionally sent experts to look in on the Bacome Art Department, hoping to recruit from that fertile source good commercial artists and designers. There was a freshness as well as a competence exhibited in James' work that caught the eye of professionals. If he continued to develop, James Redbird would have a future. As time passed, James learned to budget his hours. There were so many chores that a working scholarship required. And yet, the academic requirements of the school were rigorous, requiring hours of concentrated study, each day, every day. In such an atmosphere, there was so much to think about, so many thoughts to evaluate and absorb. In the life of this young man, who had never been sure of anything, the climate in which he lived was so abundantly stimulating that with each passing day, he could discern himself growing. There was so much to think about. A plaque carved on the Bacome chapel reads, "A Christian school planted in the midst of a people becomes one of the most powerful agencies in the work of civilization." And James found its truth demonstrated through Howard. The picture on Howard's bureau was of his brother, a Bacome student killed in the war. The boy's ideal had been to enter the ministry. Now Howard had decided to do as his brother had planned, to serve his people through God. Men like Howard Spotted Eagle influenced James to save some of his time for the promptings of his spirit. Love thy neighbor. Well, Bacome's neighbor was the Moreau Home for Orphan Indian Children, actually part of the same institution. Because of the steadily growing desire within himself to help others, he visited here often. He became a mighty busy big brother, and a mighty good one, too. In his last year at Bacome, James Redbird requested an appointment with his advisor. Requested, too, that it be held in the chapel. Mr. Taylor hadn't been surprised. He had met so many of his students in this setting over the years. Nor was he surprised at what was on James' mind, for he had been observing this young man closely, hopefully, joyfully. Under the gaze of Roger Williams, in the presence of generations of men and women who had found and worshiped God, with the gospel itself answering his questions, shaping his direction, strengthening his resolve, guided by a Christian who had himself known the experience, James Redbird made his decision to accept Christ and be baptized. Shortly thereafter, he was among those baptized by the president of this American Baptist institution. We are buried with Christ by baptism unto death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. From then on, he dedicated himself to contributing more of his time and effort and concern to the spiritual life of the school. And again, he was drawn to the children, particularly to the orphans at Moreau Home, and he was enriched by that which he gave to them. Toward the close of his senior year, James received a letter, and oddly enough, it had been addressed to him through the art department. Did he imagine it? Or did his teacher seem pleased, almost eager to give it to him? It was from a large Eastern firm in Philadelphia, an offer of a job as a commercial artist. Sounded like a marvelous opportunity. Imagine being paid to paint. Imagine going free, away from the Cherokee hills, far away from poverty and depression, paroled from the life his father and brother were sentenced to, from a life at hard labor. Here was the chance he had dreamed of, to lose his identity among the multitudes, to lose himself among those who wouldn't know his background or care. He was grateful to everyone who had influenced him to come here, to Bacome itself, to God, for surely God had granted him this opportunity to find himself. After graduation, James stopped to see Nancy on his way home. He'd waited to tell Nancy the good news rather than write. The town, the people hadn't changed, and neither had Nancy. But there was something so strange about the way she took the news of his decision to go east. She had said she was glad, but he could sense she was saying it for his sake. Surely she knew he would send for her as soon as he was earning enough for them to be married, and yet she was unhappy. He knew it, and it troubled him deeply. He'd planned to stop and thank the teacher, to tell him of the happy ending to his story. But he walked on, no longer certain of how happy the ending really was. At home, he couldn't avoid the question that rose up at him out of the depths of his heart. How happy was the ending for her? Where was the end for his father and brother, who never had a chance and probably never would? Why had the feeling of sadness he always knew in this place turned to one of guilt? Alone with his thoughts, James Redbird endeavored to take stock of himself. It hadn't been quite the happy homecoming he had anticipated. This house, his room, were depressing as ever. But somehow he was ashamed at the thought of turning his back on it. That picture, it startled him, struck a rich, responsive chord. His mind was elsewhere as he unpacked, thinking of the child who had drawn that church so crudely, and yet with so much pure faith in his crayons. Children like that needed help, deserved it. He remembered many things, each object that caught his eye releasing the flow of memory, the wonderful years at Bacome, and how they had equipped him for the give and take, the contest of life. The happy hours, the rich and abundant fellowship. How could he measure the goodness he had absorbed through the concern manifested by his teachers and friends? Nancy, why had she seemed disappointed in him when she should have been proud of what he had done with himself? The chapel steeple, like a persistent finger, pointed toward his heart, and he remembered his decision and his commitment to Christ. He heard the words re-echoing within him. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. That afternoon, carrying his unmailed letter of acceptance to the Eastern firm, James Redbird sought the solitude of the river. It was the same stream his great-grandparents had found at the end of the Trail of Tears. But the rivers still flow. The Trail of Tears winds on across the lives of a people yet in bondage, yet in need. His people. James Redbird asked himself what Christ would have him do. And the answer came, clear as the stream, and as truly with God as its source. The answer came, walk the trail with your people. Give of yourself. Do not run away to lose your identity. Remain here and find it. Remain and share the great good that has come to you with others less fortunate. Help the children, perhaps as a teacher, a Christian teacher. Help others of your race even as you were helped. Whosoever will save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Somehow the passing days had taken on new meaning since he met her. He suffered still from the harshness of his work, the grayness of his life, but at least there was something to soften the sorrow in him, to ease the bitterness, someone, Nancy, to look forward to. Perhaps it was because of her innate sensitivity, perhaps the heightened perception that sprang from her as he saw his younger brother and his father fighting an unending battle with the earth. His father, a good man, sentenced to a life at hard labor. Dana, his brother, doomed to follow in his father's footsteps. He cherished them, even as he pitied them. Hated his home, even as he loved it. His mother, how good to see her. But she looked so tired. Every line on her face was a wound within himself. She deserved so much better than this poverty, this painful existence, this day-to-day endurance which was life without hope. And parents had been driven here over the Trail of Tears. His heart cried out for his people, for the cruel burdens they bore. For the tuberculosis and malnutrition that ate their strength. For the liquor which wore down their dignity and moral fiber. And for the land, the grim, unyielding, stubborn land that was their legacy. For James Redbird, the sight of these things again made the road home a trail of tears. For he could sense that the shadow of an immense sorrow lay across this earth. The sight of home raised his spirits briefly, but they fell even further as the poverty made itself apparent. And in the months that followed, James Redbird, too, entered upon that day-to-day existence, that merciless marathon to nowhere, which is the lot of a pitiful proportion of American Indians today. He, too, worked the soil, the stubborn soil designed to raise blisters and bend hoes. With this earth, it was hopeless to await a good harvest, and yet to stop working was to starve. Now that government boarding school was behind him, life at home would have been unendurable for James if it were not for a new interest he had developed in a nearby town. It was a highly personal interest, rather breathtaking, even somewhat bewildering. A human interest, you might say, in a lovely Kiowa girl named Nancy. When the government of the United States forcibly removed the Indian tribes from their ancestral lands to the territory of Oklahoma, it pledged itself to provide these people with peace and security, to guarantee their human rights, as long as the grass shall grow, as long as the rivers still flow. James Redbird was a Cherokee, a member of that civilized tribe which had created a written language, which had produced a statesman of the caliber of Sequoyah, which had borne its abuses at the hands of the white man with patience and dignity. His family had lived in eastern Oklahoma in the valley of the Arkansas ever since his